Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the all attendees who they are joining us over the wall. I just heard that it has been a really massive, many people that join us today. So welcome to the last session of our International Women's Day series hosted by Women Beryl. Many thanks to everyone, as I said, many thanks to our partner Landor Links for organizing such a great week of events, and mainly thanks of all our panelists who will be joining to us shortly. I would like first to introduce myself. I'm Scherezade, working as a BD manager for Beryl, and my role is very much related to the topic that we are discussing today, which is like feminism and gender balance in urban planning and policy. So without further ado, I would like to start welcoming all our panelists. First, we got Fiona. She's head of neighborhoods and networks at Scherezade. So hi, Fiona. Hey, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Would you like to introduce a little bit of yourself? What did you do, your role?
Thank you. My name is Fiona Blakely. I work for Scherezade, which is the UK charity for walking and cycling. I've been a transport planner for just over 15 years now, and have been working in planning all types of transport, mostly interested in sustainable modes and what makes the earth and the planet a better place to live. Now very much focused on walking and cycling, and how activity in urban area can help us to live happier and healthier lives. Mostly working in London, but also across the UK.
Thanks very much. For sure, those 15 years will give us like a lot of to talk about. Then we got Olga. She's a senior consultant for New Mobility STIA and also co-founder of Women in Mobility London Hub. Welcome, Olga. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone. I'm pleased to be a part of this wonderful panel. I'm a senior consultant at STIA, working in new mobility. I'm passionate about how technology can improve the current transportation choices and also influence people's behavior. And as Scherezade mentioned, that I'm also a co-founder of Women in Mobility, so we'll also welcome everyone to join our group. So drop us an email on london@womeninmobility.org. Thank you.
So yes, please, I support that as in second that join that group. Then we go Elena. She's the head of UK e-scooter trials and also co-chair for the Gender DFT Equality Network. Welcome, Elena.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Eleanor Chappell. I'm, as Sherry said, I work in the Department for Transport. I've been there about 4 years. I started out in autonomous vehicles, then I did a bit of work on sort of broader future of mobility strategy and looking at regulation in particular. And now I work in e-scooters, which is how I know Beryl quite well. My role is about gathering data from the UK's trials of e-scooters to inform what we do about e-scooters going forward. And as you mentioned as well, I also co-chair the Gender Equality Network in DFT, which is an internal-facing organisation, but we're trying really hard to reach out and to join up with brilliant networks like we have here at Beryl. So I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for joining us. And we got Tiffany. She's a consultant at the New Economics Foundation. Hi, Tiffany.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Lamb. I am an expert in inclusive cycling. I've been working on this issue in Latin America, Europe, and North America for the past 7-8 years. And I'm currently based at the New Economics Foundation in London, where I'm working on issues around the Green New Deal and just transition, health inequalities, and inclusive local economic development. And I'm really happy to be on this panel.
We are really happy to have you here. And finally, with Shante, she's the Senior Manager of Venture for Climate Tech, joining us from New York. So yeah, midday for you.
Thanks, everyone. Really excited to be here. I know the rest of the women on this panel are absolutely incredible, so we're going to have a great discussion. But my background is actually working across different sectors, focused on public-private partnerships and go-to-market strategies for global companies, both established growth stage and early stage companies at the intersection of climate, urban technology and innovation in cities. Really passionate about what it means to not only build products that are intersectional and equitable, but also deploy them in a way that is done for all communities. In my free time, I run something called Women of Color Collective and Sustainability, which aims to just highlight and amplify the women of color who are doing amazing work in the sustainability space. So really excited to be here. My work now is running a climate tech venture studio and accelerator, where I'm actually building these innovations alongside founders. So really looking forward to diving into all of the discussion here today.
Many thanks. So we are going to start probably talking about a really sensitive topic, but that's what currently we have in London. We have seen that this week has been all in the media how Sarah's disappearance has been a really unfortunate event that happened when she was walking back home. For those that probably are joining around the world and they don't know much about the situation, she is a 33 years old girl who went missing in South London when she was walking back home. And the media has been, as I said, like bombarding not just about the news themselves, but also what we can do as a society to change those cities that we live in, to make it a better place, a safer place, and obviously like a safer place for women. We have also seen like many reclaims the streets, like as in group plan events to actually have vigilant events. We also saw like recently the Baroness Jones saying that all men should be banned from streets, from being outdoors, after 6 p.m. So I would really like you to give your opinion on that. Do you actually think those vigilant events that men coffee after 6 p.m. are the main factors that we need to consider, or to avoid this type of situation? There is much more that we can do as a city, as planners, to make like cities safer for everyone. So probably, Elena, you work in London, very good with data. Probably you want to give us like your opinion, probably personal and professional, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I mean, on a personal level, definitely felt quite affected by it this week. I think a lot of the communities that I'm sort of talking to within the Department for Transport and outside, just hurting a lot. And it's, this is a lot of people's worst fear, right? We grow up and we're told from such a young age that you're not safe when you use the street. I remember my grandma sitting me down when I was really young and saying, when you start walking to school, how are you going to deal with it when men approach you and say, what I used to do when I was young, and this is my grandma, she's 96 now, which shows the length that this challenge has been an issue. She said, I put my eyes down and I walk faster. And I think there's so many women internalizing these ways of, well, A, the fear, and B, ways to adapt and to get on with the day. And that's why we're not kind of, maybe historically haven't shouted out or called this out as much as before. And what's happened this week with Sarah Everard is really bringing to the fore that sometimes your worst fears can come true. And I think that's what people are calling out about today. But what's really positive is, the reaction of the community. Like you said, I mean, I'm not sure that banning men from 6 p.m. is the answer. I think there's millions of men out there who also have been contacting me within the department and the community more broadly, saying they want to help, what can they do? And that's a really excellent turning point, I think, creating that wider discussion about what we can all do to make the fear go away and the risk reduced. And so it's a bit about working together. It's a bit about the authorities, I guess, the police, the government, community leaders more widely, kind of engaging on this more than they might have done before, and working together, whether that's through data, whether that's through street design. I just think, my number one call today would be to cooperate and all to work together to address this.
Yeah, totally agree. And that actually ties us really well with the question that I was about to pose to everyone. As we all heard, you are coming from different backgrounds, private, public, and third sector. So probably we want to know more about do you actually think that each of those sectors play a role in impacting the gender and how we plan cities and policies? Maybe you, Fiona, after being working 15 years, like working all across three, probably you want to give us a full overview.
I agree with what Eleanor's just said, really. It's incumbent on all of us. It doesn't really matter what sector we're working in, to make sure that we collaborate and we work together. I think every sector has a different role to play. So yes, I've worked in public, private, and now in the third sector. The role that I take now, I still am involved in designing the spaces and places and streets of our cities, despite the fact that I don't work for the local government. But I think it's really important that the work that we do influences and really pushes government authorities to strive to be better and to be as good as they can be, and really push that forward. We know that there is lots in urban design and street space design that can make places both actually safer and improve perceptions of safety and remove fear. I personally don't think that removing men after a certain time is the way forward. I think that kind of gender division is really dangerous because there are dangerous women and lots of very safe men. So to make those kind of divisions, I think we want society to be more collaborative and to work better together, and creating more division is definitely not the way forward. I'm going to see if any of the other panelists want to come in.
Yeah, Fiona and Eleanor, I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think the personal safety as being a woman walking on the streets or undertaking journey in any transport is actually something which resonates with lots of people. It certainly resonates with myself. I personally experienced harassment being in the transport, and I think it was in the US and metro. And it's not a pleasant experience, and it also depends on how you hold with it. And but yeah, I definitely agree that banning men from the streets it's not the solution, because, as you said, there are good men and bad women. And I think actually encouraging partnerships between men and women is the way forward, because it's about making the world work for both women and men, for all the genders, and it's about making it a better place. And I think in terms of when we look at the urban planning and what we can do better, I think one of the probably key things which stands out for me is when we plan or issue any policy documents, we need to take into account the gender equality. And well, one of the kind of interesting things which I came across recently was about in the UK, each authority tries to issue an active travel plan. And so far, those active travel plans are designed to encourage people to cycle. And if you look at it, I don't think the majority of them taking into account the preferences of women. And I think when those plans are being designed, or similar documents, and women are involved into the planning and to the research and design of them, it can actually bring it can bring better outcomes. And I think this is the way forward. And it's not about, like, again, it's like men and men after sex is discrimination. So it's about working together to improve the current situation.
Totally agree. It's like I couldn't agree more with you. I think like joint collaboration is main one. Probably Elena can give us like a little bit more insight on data. Where does it factor in all this urban planning and make it, like, as we are saying, as cities safer for women and for everyone?
Yeah, sure. I mean, on the data side, we've actually had quite a lot of data in the UK that is sex disaggregated from the National Travel Survey. So the UK has one of the best data sets in terms of understanding how people travel. And obviously from that, you can understand how to plan around that. I think also with future mobility, with connected vehicles, e-scooters, for example, as well, e-bikes, we're definitely getting a much more granular picture of the way that vehicles are moving around. I think what's missing and where the challenge lies is obviously getting a intersectional, diverse picture of who's moving where in a way that also respects data protection and sort of being able to recognize individuals, etc. And that's where the huge opportunity is by sharing aggregated open data, but also the risks are obviously, and that's something that I found in my role as trying to collect data for e-scooters. We're trying to understand what types of people are using e-scooters, how that increases access to opportunity for people according to disability, race, age, gender, and a few other things too. But there are challenges in collecting that data in a UK GDPR appropriate way, and also obviously in a way that people are comfortable with when they maybe don't fully understand what the outcomes can be, because we've not really done this as a transport sector before to this level of granularity. But I think that is what's needed. We know from books like Invisible Women by Caroline Corrado Perez that this disaggregation of data by different characteristics is so key to understanding the impact of transport on so many aspects of life. And I think that's where data, understanding the experiences of specific people as much as we can, is where the real opportunity with data lies in with this sort of gender responsive transport planning.
I'd love to build off of that briefly. Having worked with particularly startups and I think new technologies that are starting to capture this data, I find that it's often an afterthought, right? When products or technologies or solutions are built, it's then how do we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, or what does it look like to deploy in a manner that allows for privacy, that doesn't, I think, continue to perpetuate stereotypes and discriminatory ways of viewing certain populations. And so when I think about, all of the solutions that can be implemented and should be implemented to solve this problem, I really think that the two that come to mind is how do we ensure that the solutions, the technologies, how we're capturing the data starts from a framework of inclusivity. So including women, including people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color at the very start in both the planning process and then the adoption and identification of the technologies that we utilize, and then also the analysis, because I think if we're going to get to the heart of a lot of these problems and also the nuances here, right, as we're talking about, do we let men out after 6 p.m.? I think most people know that that's not the real solution here, right? And maybe it's a Band-Aid solution, but the longer term solution is how do we build our streets, as Eleanor alluded to be safer? How do we think about infrastructure and urban planning as a solution? I think in order to do that, we have to amplify women in leadership. We have to let them be at the forefront of designing these solutions, of designing these plans. And again, I think the technology, the planning processes, all of them have to start with, equity, accessibility, safety being at the heart of how they're developed, rather than, oh, we've now identified that there's some very unique big challenges here, and so we're going to talk about it later. So I'm really passionate. I think that's why I work with very early stage founders, because I've noticed that that's not what's happening, and that's because it's not diverse. And so how do we, how do we put short-term solutions, but then really get to the root of these problems so that we're also thinking about it strategically over the long term?
I think it's
yeah.
Really
Go ahead.
I think it's really important to collect gender disaggregated data and other forms of disaggregated data, since we can't assume that all people travel or use public space in the same way. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that quantitative data does not tell the whole story and cannot be privileged as the only form of information that we use to base decisions about infrastructure and public space design. So, for example, perceptions and experiences of safety are heavily shaped by gender. They are qualitative, and it's not something you can quantify, but gendered perceptions of safety really impact daily decisions that women and girls make about whether they go out, how they get around, when they do it, and for how long. So it's really important to understand and incorporate gendered experiences and perceptions of safety in policy and planning. And we do have tools like UN Women advocate for the usage of safety audits to capture these nuances about how safe and comfortable people, particularly women and girls, feel out at different times of day. So they have to be more embedded in other forms of data collection and analysis.
Before I just ask you a question about that, I would just to remind the audience that they can pop any questions that they have in the box. So we will run a Q&A section at the very end of today. So yeah, Tiffany, very important points. And that's more a question from myself, actually. And I'm gonna just jump on that. It's like, how do you actually think is the best way to collect that data?
So I think gender safety audits are quite powerful in that it's a form of co-production, because typically it involves a group of women or girls walking around together or even cycling, and just assessing different aspects of the built environment as well as other factors that make them feel safe or unsafe. And in along Latin American cities, for instance, things like street lighting or presence of an authoritative figure at a bus stop or something, those have been identified as really important factors that shape gendered perceptions of safety. And so these are quite relatively easy and cheap things to implement, like improved lighting, improved sight lines, so you don't have hedges or big rubbish bins blocking your sites, and just that feeling that there are like eyes on the street or other people are around to see and look out for you in case something happens.
Yeah, totally. Maybe Olga, you want to add something on that, as Gia probably like in the middle ground between public and private, and you probably get a lot to deal with that data.
I completely agree with Tiffany about that also. Qualitative research is really what gives you the full picture, and I think that ethnographic research, especially when you can follow the women and understand better on what she experienced at different stages of the journey, I think this is very powerful. It hasn't been kind of done a lot. I think another point that yes, like even improving the street lighting can do a lot, but also I think it's important to think about how you improve and how you design that street lighting, because actually just installing street lights can create the pockets of darkness, which actually can make the whole area much worse. So it's not like, oh, let's install the lights because well, everyone will feel safer. It's about how you do it to make sure that it actually works, and I think it's quite important aspect to it. And I think also what Chantal was saying is about if you want to plan a project or service or improve the urban realm around you, just ask about your objectives and then kind of do the sense check. Are those objectives are relevant for both women and men? And if yes, yeah, then I think it would be right to proceed. But it's always kind of good to go back and ask that question: what you're doing, is it equal? Is it takes into account the needs of other people or different user types? And I think even just, as I said, this simple question can help a lot. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah, I think that we need to get in the mindset of collating data, and Tiffany was saying not just qualitative, quantitative, and get that together to make a better place. And probably all of us that, except for Shantae, that sees more in the tech industry, but not as much in cycling and transport.
I've worked with some cycling and transport. Yeah, I've worked with e-scooters and helped them scale in the US, and then also large fleet manufacturers of vehicles. So my current focus is climate innovation and kind of early stage companies, which include mobility, but I've had extensive experience working to scale mobility companies in New York and the US.
So all got the same main focus and point. And something that I wanna just open a topic with all of you is what do you think is the role of transport to bring positive outcomes for women and girls, the future generations actually? So maybe Shante, do you want to go on?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, I was mentioning this earlier to the other panelists, but NYU Rudin Center for Transportation several months ago actually did a workshop focused on the pink mobility tax. I think a lot of folks know what that is here, but essentially looking at transportation from the perspective of what is the additional cost, I think both social and economic costs placed on women as a result of how they move throughout urban areas and cities to feel safer and also have safety assured in the decisions that they're making around their transportation. And so a lot of really great ideas came out of that session. I think what was so great about it was that it wasn't just policymakers, it wasn't just investors, it wasn't just founders, it was all of these folks. And I think the more that we really move through silos and bring people together who are on the data side of things, who are on the policy side of things, who are also investing in these technologies and quite frankly don't necessarily know how they scale or at what rate they scale or place really unfair expectations about how they scale. What you've seen is that how that trickles down into how they're deployed. So I think in New York, what made e-scooters so interesting, and really I won't say which company I worked with, but the one that is now operating in New York, what differentiated them in the market was that they actually focused on women and on people of color. And they were able to show a demand for those groups that wanted to use e-scooters and change the profile. I mean, I think it's no secret that when we talk about e-scooters and how they were introduced to most communities, it was not a diverse profile of who uses that product. And so I think when we talk about what do we need to be doing for women and girls moving forward around safety, we have to be talking about what does it mean to build solutions for them from the start. And when I say solutions, it's not just technologies, it's also things like an audit that folks were alluding to earlier. I know from my experience, while the audit has existed, it hasn't necessarily been implemented across cities, and they're not necessarily using it to the extent that they could be. And so while it was something that existed, it was something that also came up again as, oh, right, we should be implementing for every planning process that involves transportation or the built environment and infrastructure, an audit that looks at the solutions, the technologies, and the planning processes around that to focus on women's safety. And so my recommendation would just be, to do what we're doing now and have a comprehensive approach to the stakeholders that are involved in the planning process, and also to bring women in, right? Like everyday women who are going through the city, who are experiencing what it feels like to be in an urban environment, and actually use them as case studies and get some of that qualitative data and analysis that Tiffany was alluding to.
Totally agree. I think that's a key point, to bring everyone together around the table these days around the e-meetings. But yeah, I think it's key to get all those views, actually take into account what everyone thinks. And probably Fiona got like a lot to say about that, because I know that Sustrans, they are very much interested in just studying the data, reducing the gender gap, knowing why many more women should be there and they are not still cycling, for example.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we have both sides of the picture. We've touched on data and how important that is, and it is really important that we do have some cold hard facts, because to some people that's what really resonates and that's the language they speak. But I agree with what Tiffany was saying as well. That has to go alongside the qualitative. We have to go and listen to individual people's stories and understand genuine experiences. Quite a lot of the time we talk about experiencing the urban environment through different people's lenses, and you can try and imagine what it's like for other people who are different to yourself, but really you can't properly until you take a really diverse group of people physically out into a space and talk to them about their experiences and how they find being in that space and moving through it. And I think it's really important that we do a lot of work in schools, for example, and we really learn so much from interacting with kids and taking them out onto the streets and understanding what it's like when actually you're not even a meter tall, and how does the street look from your perspective and getting them to tell you. Sometimes they'll tell you they want you to put a zip slide down the street, or like a trampoline in the middle of the road, but you do get genuine super insight from working with the people that you're trying to design for, and that applies to everybody. It's not just about children, it's not just about women, it's about taking groups that are diverse across a huge range of physical and different characteristics, and really saying, how do you experience this space, and what do you need from this kind of environment, and what are the needs that are not being met. And it can be as simple as understanding that women need to sit down, and if you're talking about mothers, they need space to sit down and breastfeed. They need to be able to take their pushchairs or their prams into the toilet with them. There's a huge range of fundamental issues about the built environment, and it's not just about how we travel, but when you start talking to people about their experiences of place, they'll tell you this massive range of things. I have a load of colleagues who are really passionate about public toilets, which isn't necessarily to do with walking and cycling at all, but it's actually a really important part of the built environment that's been getting progressively worse, and it is really important when we're talking about the gender differences of how places are experienced.
Yeah, and I think probably like, Elena got a lot to say about that, just like because you obviously co-chair the DFT network, and I think that's something that you come up like probably almost every day.
Yeah, well, so the Gender Equality Network is an internal facing team or network within the Department for Transport. So we mainly focus on empowerment of staff within DFT, raising creating platforms for discussion and challenging, I guess, HR functions within the organisation. But this conversation has made me think about, obviously, the calls for consultation with real people on the ground. And Chanti, you said earlier about the need for more women in leadership positions in transport. And I completely agree with that. We do sort of collaborative work across the sector to support that as well. But actually, I think one of the biggest challenges that we've faced historically, and probably still now, is that women aren't organised as a easily consultative group. You know, disabled people have got charities that you can really clearly say, oh, that's who I need to go to understand the different needs of disabled people, for example. And I don't think, Sustrans is doing some brilliant work. I know Women's Budget Group. There are various groups across the UK who are thinking about this, but I don't think, and I'm sure, I don't know if this would be welcome in DFT, but I think we need to lobby more. I think we need more people to tell authorities what women want, and I don't think that's being voiced enough at the highest levels, really. I think, we need more of a push from women, but I'm not sure as a community we're organised enough to really fight our case right now.
So just like very linked to that, probably it's an open question for everyone, just to say, like, what do you think is next in the cities? How do you see the cities looking like in few years? How do we think that we need to plan for those future generations to actually cycle, scooter, or like be safer on the streets?
Can I jump on? Because, I think recently everyone had about the concept of 15-minute city. So basically it's creating the cities where everything is in your reach, in a walkable or cyclable distance. And I think it's quite close to the patterns which women have, because they normally tend to have sometimes shorter journeys and lots of journeys. And often women take care of their kids. And I think if you can create the 15-minute city, can be actually a city designed for women potentially. I'm not kind of advocating saying that we all need to have the 15-minute city, but I think this concept is actually quite close to being looking after the women's needs. So I'd like to see more 15-minute city initiatives around. And I think another point is that, I would potentially give advice for any local authority or any company which does major infrastructure or planning project, hire a gender specialist. If you don't have a specific person, just hire a gender consultant who will make sure that the women's needs are being looked at through all the phases as we talk through the planning, through the design and implementation, and monitoring and evaluation afterwards. I think that's kind of couple of thoughts from myself.
I think the 15-minute city is certainly very trendy right now, and it's been raised as a key part of a green and just recovery. And I think there's a lot of potential there, but there's also a risk that the 15-minute city as a concept fundamentally ignores historic legacies of racial segregation and economic inequality, and existing inequalities in travel time, where across many cities, it's often lower income people who have the longest commute. So I think there are bigger questions around for whom is the 15-minute city. And I think in terms of thinking about the future city and future urban infrastructure and transport systems, we really have to reframe it so that it's not just a technocratic issue focusing on engineering, economics, or technology, but really just a wider lens through which we see and understand broader social justice issues. And planning cities, planning transport systems, that's fundamentally about trying to democratize the right to the city, the right to safe urban mobility, the right to participate in public life and be a part of your built environment and your communities. And we know that that's not equal, and it will continue to be really deeply unequal without more expertise on gender and other issues around social inclusion and more diverse representation and leadership.
Totally.
Yeah, I love that. Totally. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you go first.
I was just gonna say, Tiffany, thank you for saying that. I feel like you read my mind. But yeah, I've had some conversations about the 15-minute city. I think it's an incredible framework for this idea of us having what we need, particularly in light of COVID, and I think an increased discussion around local economies. I think the reality, though, is that we're seeing that that's not the case, both when it comes to mobility, but just access to what is needed at a time like the one we're experiencing. That being said, again, I think it's a great way of introducing this discussion of like, how can we move around cities and get what we need. I think for me, it really goes back to my experience of like working across sectors. I think the reality is that what you don't see is enough of that collaboration that I was talking about. And so oftentimes we'll see technologies or data solutions deployed, and the question of by whom and for whom certainly resonates with me again, Tiffany, on the side of innovation and technology. And then we're deploying those, or oftentimes policies are trying to mitigate the challenges that have risen in light of these technologies being built and deployed. And so I'm really passionate about and interested in this intersection of what you do see in the US. I'm not as familiar on the global front, but some more agencies that certainly need to be more diverse when it comes to women and other marginalized communities, being at the forefront of not only funding, but really thinking through R&D and early stage technologies, because I think the reality is that technology and innovation is not going anywhere. Every time I open Twitter, I'm like in awe of all of these announcements around a new city being built. And I'm like, well, what happens to our old cities, right? And what happens to the people who have existed in those cities and found upward mobility and access? Are we saying that that's not the city anymore? Or we're not investing in those cities? And so I guess to put it in a nutshell, there needs to be a lot more communication about what innovation is. And I don't think it's just technology, right? It is urban farming and community-based gardens that allow people access to local foods. It is thinking about mobility and shared mobility solutions for community that does or doesn't implement technology. So I think really looking at it from a social innovation perspective and asking the question of who's implementing our ideas and technologies, who's building them, and then who's creating policy around them or in response to them.
I was just about to say that, yeah, please do keep in mind that, because we got a really interesting question coming through, and it's like, how do we actually provide safer, smaller towns, not just big cities, because nowadays we are focusing too much in big cities, developing, as Ante was saying, like new cities, but what's happening what we have already there. So yeah, probably Fiona or Elena, if you want to give just your view on how did you see like cities progressing, looking like in few years' time?
I was just going to say briefly that I think we all know what a city transport network has historically looked like, and that's the radial routes into the centre. because that's the economic heart of a city where all the men go to work. Now that's an incredibly simplistic view, but actually if you look at aerial views of most large cities, that is how it looks, and that's how transport planning, certainly across the UK, has always been. And we rely heavily on particularly census data, all about and it's all about travel to work. How do men get to work? And actually, women are included in that, but the number of women who work part-time, who have those incredibly complex trip patterns that are not just from home to work and back home again. And I think there is becoming an acknowledgement of how that is changing, but what that looks like for big cities, but also for much smaller settlements. I mean, the last year has been really interesting in terms of how everyone's travel horizons have had to be brought much closer. I've constantly over the last year heard stories of people exploring their local neighbourhoods, going for walks, finding much more about how their neighbourhood works and what is local to them. So I think there is an element of the sort of the 15-minute concept and bringing services closer to people. But I also think that the way our spatial patterns are going to change is we will have much better networks. We have to have much better networks across the whole city that aren't just about that single trip in and out of the central business district. It will be much more about enabling people to travel across the city from their local neighbourhoods to the neighbouring ones, to enable them to do all the trips they need to do. And by doing that, we will cater much better for everybody's needs.
I think on a sort of similar theme, with regards to improving local transport, I think the future, as you asked, is actually could just be about better bus networks, as Fiona was pulling out. You know, designing that around the actual needs of the people rather than kind of perceived needs. Now that maybe make more community engagement, basically, to understand what people really want. I don't think it's necessarily all about the technology and the cool solutions that work so well in urban environments. I think the rural or the small town concept is probably to some extent going back to basics. You better cycling infrastructure, better walkways, and lighting, as we said before, but all sort of consulting with the people. And the question itself asks specifically about safety. So when there's fewer passers-by and bystanders, how do you create that sense of safety? I think that comes down to engaging with people at the local level and raising that awareness among the whole town, so anybody who's walking past or walking by knows that they've got this responsibility to make sure that those around them feel safe as well and behaving in certain ways to facilitate that. Yeah, that's about safety. That's what I'd say.
That's exactly the question that I was just referring to. It was more like, how do we actually ensure safety in those places where there are like narrow streets, really dark places that you don't want to go? And if anything or anyone got anything else to add, or do you want me to jump on the Q&As? Are you ready for that?
I'd like to echo something on what Fiona was saying about the radio planning fallacy. That is quite widespread internationally, and one thing that gives me hope is that in Latin America, in certain countries, there's an increasing focus on the mobility of care, with the idea that rather than prioritizing this typical journey to work into city center that just a very select proportion of the population do, that there needs to be a wider emphasis on care, because if we want a care-led green and just recovery, then part of that is enabling care-related journeys, and that includes all dimensions of care, care for sick people, older people, children, self-care, and it's really important to prioritize safe, accessible, and affordable and comfortable routes to places like hospitals, doctors' offices, shops and supermarkets, schools, so that there isn't just this central focus on going to work or to the office, especially as that's been really flipped during the pandemic. And on the point about safety in smaller areas, I think a lot of it is it's going to require interventions that are not spatial. I want to point out that under austerity, a lot of women's services, services for women fleeing domestic violence, things like that, they are often the first things to get cut. So I think part of it is, governments need to spend money to accelerate this recovery. So in making these spending decisions, they have to be equitable and redress harms done by austerity, done by just ripping away at social safety nets. So part of making women feel safer is also investing in social infrastructure, these services that we need and rely on to ensure that we are healthy and well, like education-related services, social care, health, all of that is foundational to what makes people feel safe.
Yeah, and I know we need to move on to Q&A, but one thing that I think is really important to note is just the sustainability piece in all of this. Women are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis and the first to be mostly impacted when it comes to any sort of disaster. I mean, we've seen that firsthand in Texas, for example, in the US. And I think as we're talking about the future of mobility and safety for women, thinking about how do we bake in sustainability and those solutions that are accounting for our environment and our climate is really important. I mean, women, low-income communities, BIPOC communities have historically lived in areas where there are more bus depots, where there are more heat islands, where there's more air quality issues and thus higher rates of asthma. So when I think about safety, I also think about well-being and health. And I think that, we have to be looking at this topic from a standpoint of, hey, everyone's really excited about climate now. Everyone's talking about sustainability. I love to see it. And how do we make sure that we don't lose the importance of incorporating sustainability into these conversations around safety for women and those who have been impacted via health or their ability to, get around the city and have upward mobility as it relates to transportation and mobility as a whole.
I just wanted to add on that point that do you really think that knowing that you've got different backgrounds, obviously someone coming from the United States, we know that Tiffany has been working all over around the world, mainly we got British. Do you actually think that is a cultural thing? Is it different around the world in different countries? Do you have a view on that?
Me personally? Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think I've talked a lot about place-based innovation and coined something called creative community resilience. And essentially what that means to me is that we actually use the idea of place-based and community to both ensure and inform the way that we build solutions for community. So not just technologies, even though that's been my focus for the past few years, but also planning processes and policies as a whole coming out of government. And so I think what will work right in New York City won't necessarily apply in London. I do think there are a lot of things that we can take, whether it's like what didn't work or what could work from urban environments generally, and we should be building off one another rather than not communicating and talking about what we're working on. But I think ultimately, like, communities know what they need, they know what they desire, they're living it firsthand every day. And so I think while we're talking broadly about solutions here, we have to be talking about it from a place-based viewpoint that does prioritize that specific community. So yeah, I would totally be remiss if I tried to act like what's happening in the US applies all over the globe. I think that's not fair, and also is not going to get us to what we want to see ultimately.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency to want to import like silver bullet solutions from other parts of Europe or the US. And like Shantae said, that isn't really possible since solutions have, I think there's a lot you can learn from good practice globally, and those elements of good practice can be adapted or somehow incorporated into wider local initiatives that are addressing the context-specific needs of people.
I would add that.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Just that I think place-based solutions really important. Completely agree with that. But with so much of the discussions that we're having about gender-responsive transport, I think we on this call, and I'm sure the people listening, are quite far ahead in our thinking. But the transport sector more broadly, I think has still got a long way to go. And actually noticing the global trends, the fact that all over the world women find it harder to access transport, that has similar themes across the world in terms of ability to access jobs, education, healthcare. I think putting that global perspective, that global data, just helps our argument to, I guess, implement those local place-based things. I think just recognizing that this is a huge global thing that we're trying to solve is a valuable way to kind of make the point that these issues are happening, and yes, we need to implement them in a local way.
Yeah, I wanted to add about the countries and differences between the culture. Well, you can't avoid it. There will be the differences, and you should design each solution based on local people and their needs. But I think, well, in general, from my experience, I can see that in developing countries, the gender issues is more often overlooked. It's just because they have other priorities the government is looking after, unfortunately. And I think that's why it's kind of so important that, you know, more wealthy countries support less developed countries. I'm generalizing now, but this is kind of from where I'm coming from, and from traveling around the world. And if we find this issues in the UK, so I'm just like, what's happening in other countries which are less developed, and how can we support this? I think it's one of the questions which I constantly ask myself, and how we can, you know, share our experience, and what would be the best way. I don't know what others think about it, actually. It would be good to know.
That's great. I would just bring it up because obviously I've been brought up outside the UK as well. I'm Spanish, and I can see the difference when I first came here. Also, I can see the difference what Shantae, for example, has been like sharing with us. So that's something that I wanted actually to make everyone aware on the call. And I would just like to share with the audience a comment that we got, and it's back to the 15-minute city approach. And they would say, like, I would like to challenge the thought that women are main carers of children, and therefore the 15-minute city is great for them. Fathers have the same level of responsibilities and ownership when it comes to child care. So this is an approach is great for parents as a whole.
Yeah, I didn't mean that 15 minutes. 15 minutes, the concept is just for women. I just thought that sometimes it looks like you can take care of what some of the needs, specific needs, which more women have. That's what I meant.
And I think coming back to the data, that does show that women have far greater caring responsibilities. Yes, that is changing, and we know that across society, both from the data and from the experiences as well of our friends and our families. But it's a slow process to change, and a lot of the data that's come out in the last year is that actually the pandemic has really exacerbated the fact that that women's caring responsibilities have rocketed. Even in family units that were much more equitable in the past, changing the pandemic and children being off school and childcare issues and balancing home and work and all of those things has actually potentially put things back quite a long way in some instances. So yes, it's definitely something we should be campaigning for and changing, and it is changing. But at the moment, that is still the reality, is that women have more caring responsibilities, both for children, but also for relatives and neighbours and all those kinds of part of their communities.
Yeah, I do totally agree with that. Like, it's good that it's changing the role models that we have in society, but it's still a long way to go, and it's still like women have that mother role or child care role. But yeah, it's changing. But I think as in cycling, it will take a long way until we get there. And one of the final questions that we got from the audience is like, can, I guess, like it's addressed to all of you, so probably you want to give us like one company or organization that you think it would be great to partnership with. I guess in terms of like, who would you partner with in terms of planning a city? Can you think of anyone, any good organizations that they are out there that will be like great partners to have the city that we want to have in the future?
I'll start. Yeah, I think there's a lot. I mentioned NYU Rooted Center earlier, and that's particularly because it's under leadership of a woman named Sarah Kaufman, and I think it's just incredible and continuing to bring diverse voices to the table. For those who don't know, New York University plays a huge role in sort of New York conversations that are specific to mobility. So I think really what you can take from that is that academic institutions and bringing in experts, particularly to interact with policymakers and other stakeholders, I think is, again, this cross-sector collaboration that we need to be seeing more of and really be championing. The next thing I'll say is just the company I work for, Second Use. We're a global innovation impact firm. We work with corporations, governments, cities, founders, and investors to think about how do we build local sustainable economies that are regenerative and inclusive. We love this work. It's literally what we talk about all day, and we think that there's a lot of opportunity to address challenges and bring in folks who have historically, either not been brought to the table or just not heard, even if they were, at the table. So I think that's really important to us, and we're running a few different initiatives, including Melinda Gates' Precursor Ventures, Get Cities initiatives. For those who don't know, it's focused on getting more women involved in technology. So really excited about what that means for all of the conversations that we're having here. But that's just an example of some of the work that we're doing across the globe. We also work with some entrepreneurs in Singapore, a lot of other places to think about how do we build, again, economies that really foster development, both economic and I think personal development for those who are trying to build solutions for everyone. So yeah, I'll stop there.
In terms of gender safety audits, UN Women and Safety Pin are kind of the leaders, and then they work with cities globally to help improve perceptions and experiences of safety for women and girls. I also think that it's important to maybe reframe the question, and instead of thinking about organizations to partner with, it would be worth asking, how can planning processes be more participatory? How can we more meaningfully engage with local communities so that their input is more embedded in the design and implementation of public space and infrastructure?
I think I mentioned earlier about incorporating children, and we do an awful lot of work of designing with kids. They're the future users of our cities. I mean, I in another bit of my life, I volunteer for girl guiding, so talking to girls and young people and existing movements like the Guides and the Scouts and those kind of people, getting young people's input through their eyes. If you're designing a safe space for children, it will most likely be a safe space for adults as well. So it's a really great place to start in involving young people. Yeah, I think that applies to the planning point that Tiffany's just made as well. There's an organization that I literally came across a couple of days ago called Make Space for Girls. And again, that's all about creating places that young women and girls feel comfortable and safe. And I think if we can look beyond ourselves to the younger generations, then yeah, we'll create great places for the future.
For sure, this is a good one to look at. And Olga, Elena, would you like just to share at least one?
Well, one of the initiatives which stands out, I think, is Bikes for All. It's about the training, and to do promote inclusive training for everyone. And I think some of the approaches is really good. I think Como UK, with their annual surveys, it can be a good source of the data, especially on data on women, how to use different chatbots. I don't know, I was thinking about transport focus, because it's kind of the key area to understand the behaviors of people on all transport modes almost in the UK, public transport modes. I don't know, what would you add?
Yeah, I was thinking Como UK and transport focus too. And then I suppose Innovate UK is the kind of organisation within government that helps to fund projects, and I know they're thinking a lot about the social impact of what we're investing in. So I think they'd have some good links there with this sort of thing. Otherwise, I was also thinking I don't really have a good answer to this. So if you did want to ask in the UK about who to go to, that's definitely something I'll be thinking about. So you can email me at eleanor.chapel@dft.gov.uk, and I'd be happy to sort of field that further down the line.
So I think we are coming to the end. If anyone else want to add anything, I can't see any more questions from the audience. So yeah, I would like to thank you all for your time, and just like I hope to have you here next year.